Well, hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm President and CEO of the Asian Society in New York. Welcome to this series of conversations with Asian Americans building America. I call it ABBA, A-A-B-A. We're speaking with people from vastly different backgrounds across this great country about the contributions they're making to the US of A. And today we're joined by Billie Tsien, an architect who, together with her husband, Todd Williams, has received among the world's most prestigious awards for architecture. Her works include, for example, the Obama Presidential Center in Chicago, the Tata Consultancy Services building in India, the David Rubenstein Atrium at the Lincoln Center in New York, and our own Asia Society building in Hong Kong, where she's done work as well. In fact, if you've been to our Hong Kong Center, it is a signature building, and Billie, you are to be congratulated on it. She's also the first woman to chair the Commission of Fine Arts in Washington, D.C., and she was nominated to that position by President Biden. So, Billie, welcome to our program.
Oh, thank you so much.
Tell us about your background. You're a New Yorker. We've read that you describe yourself as culturally American and temperamentally Chinese. What on earth does that mean?
My parents came from Shanghai, and they were in the sort of wave of Chinese students who came after the war, but before the sort of doors closed. And so it was a very particular time, the late 40s, early 50s. And so I was born in Ithaca, New York. They were at Cornell. And we soon moved eventually to a suburb in New Jersey, where we were the only Asian family, one other who had went to the same high school but didn't live in the same town. So it was sort of like we were sort of the pair that were supposed to be together. And
I hope you got on with them, whoever the other person was.
For sure, but I was hoping for a somewhat larger circle of friends than the one who was assigned. But so it was a very American, sort of middle-class American upbringing. And so I very much at that time wanted to be part of, sort of like everybody else. But at the same time, I was growing up in a home where both my parents were Chinese from China. And so I deeply believe that all of my the sort of psychological sort of reactions, behaviors are very Chinese. Todd calls me the Great Wall of China because when I get angry, I'm both very silent and it lasts for a very long time. And I know that so that there are parts of me that are deeply Chinese, even as I am pretty much a sort of nincompoop when it comes to really knowing about Chinese history and Chinese culture, because in the end, it's an American culture and an American history that I'm most familiar with. So it's good to be both, kind of.
Well, I'm kind of the reverse, I suppose. I mean, I grew up in the Occident. I'm from Australia. I spent a fair bit of my working life, though, in China. And certainly in other parts of, let's call it Greater China, Taiwan and Hong Kong and elsewhere. And so there are points of cultural crossover where you sometimes wonder precisely where you're from. But for me, my sense of identity, of course, has always been as an Australian. But like the United States, it's a multicultural. And so it's both an Australian and not just in my case, an Anglo-Australian. But it's in a culture and a society which is now refreshingly diverse, which is the America that I experience so often when I'm in the States. Tell me, in your field of architecture, are there many Asian American women who are active, or is it a white Anglo enclave? Give me a sense of it.
There are quite a few Asian American women. Probably more so in academia, teaching and running schools in very high positions. There are probably fewer women who are leading offices. Of course, for me, there was IMK, and he was actually a sort of very, very kind to us. And I think, recommended us for some jobs that he wasn't that interested in that had an Asian connection. So he recommended us for the East Asian Library at UC.
Yeah.
And so he was always a kind of icon to look to. But I think as time goes on, the profession, which has traditionally been a very white male and very privileged group of people, I think is trying to understand where it is in the world today and how it can be relevant in the world today. I mean, in the end, I think what we all want to do is make buildings that improve the lives of people who use them. And so that's a kind of universal thing. I think that for Asian American women, I think for better or worse, and I do think it's a kind of Asian trait to think before you say. And so that also means that you're quite a good listener. And I think to be a great listener helps you become
us guys, we always speak before we think, you know that.
I'm married to one, so we balance each other.
Tell me, in terms of your reflections about being an Asian American, you've grown up in the United States, in New Jersey and Ithaca, in informing your sense of the aesthetic, that is what you seek to infuse in your own design. Can you consciously articulate what effect that's had on you, or is it so imbibed that you are no longer conscious of it?
No, I think it is apparent in the work that we do and in the values that we have. I don't think of Chinese architecture, Chinese gardens, maybe even Chinese characters being particularly serene, but I do think that there is a sense of rootedness, which I associate with calmness. So the sense of calmness, I think, has always been really, really important in the work that we make. It's very, very important that one enters a place of calm, and as well that the building is not something that's flashy or kind of object. It's not sculptural. It's not a look at me. It's more about a slow process where somebody comes in and then they start to understand and enjoy the space. So there's a kind of idea of slightly sort of withholding a kind of immediate gratification for a slower appreciation, which I also think is a sort of Asian characteristic. Of course, one could say, oh, look at the buildings that are happening all over China, and they're sort of some of the most expressive and crazy architecture that one might see in the world. But I do think, and there are now a sort of new school of architects, Wang Shu, who won the Pritzker Prize, where architects are starting to look at what is, in a certain way, basically sort of Chinese rather than an import. So, and I see this in the students that we teach as well, because Todd and I teach at Yale. And over time, we've seen the students from China become much more interested in what feels to them authentic.
Yeah, I mean, as a student of architecture yourself and as a practitioner, I'm sure you're fully across the contributions of Frank Lloyd Wright and the rest of them. I'm just an amateur in this field. I just observe, and I know what I like. If you asked me to design a building tomorrow, I wouldn't know what the first step was. But I'm always fascinated. Do you remember the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which Frank Lloyd Wright designed? And then the Japanese, in a moment of insanity, sometime in the 60s, demolished the building. I would like to meet the planning official who did that and ask what were they thinking, but leave that to one side. When you look at Frank Lloyd Wright's work, whether it's that, as he seeks to integrate a range of cultural traditions into his sense of the aesthetic, but even when I've walked around Fallingwater, and this echoes your sense of peace and calm and the use of water, probably in a slightly more Japanese way than a Chinese way. Do you think Frank Lloyd Wright was kind of at the forefront of introducing these traditions into the American architectural canon, or is it more complex than that, or have I just said something completely stupid?
No, I don't think you've said anything stupid at all. I mean, I think that Wright who's also very, very a big collector of Japanese prints. So you're right; it is a sort of much more Japanese influence. I think it had a huge connection in his soul with this idea of a kind of architecture of essentially sort of small spaces, compressed spaces that open up, not actually into huge spaces, but open up and give a sense of sort of relief by quite subtle changes. And this idea of a kind of decoration which was not applied but intrinsic to the actual building itself. And I think of those two sort of qualities as being very Japanese. And certainly it's expressed in gardens. I mean, Todd and I spent time studying and visiting both Chinese gardens and Japanese gardens, and they're sort of a world apart. But I think what unites them is the desire to create a kind of separated world from every place else. So whether it's the minimalism and the sort of purity of a Japanese garden like Yoryongji, where there's so few things, or whether it's like the gardens in Suzhou, which are so many things. The whole idea, as soon as you enter into one, you have left the world behind. And I think that's something that Wright was interested in. I know that that's something that very much that we're interested in too, that when you enter, you leave the world behind. And that has very much to do with creating that sense of separation and calm.
Tell me, in your own life, have you, and most recently, do you experience racism? Racial comments?
I never, that's an interesting question. Certainly, growing up in New Jersey, there were, I think when anybody has a preconceived notion of who you are in a certain way, whether it's negatively expressed or even in the most positive way, like, oh, you're so smart, or you'll be good in math, or any of those things, any preconceived notion which puts you into a sort of category is in a way a sort of quiet and subtle racism. So I know that this is something that I grew up with and is something that I'm aware of. For the first time in New York, I have to say, and I've always thought of New York as the place to go where you can be anybody and anything. And it's still, for all intents and purposes, true. But for the first time, there was a period of time when I felt like, well, I'm glad I've got my mask, I've got a hat on and some sunglasses, and felt as if I needed to be a little bit more aware of what was around me as I moved around. I do feel lucky to be in a city on the East Coast. And that's not to say that, people in the middle are, going to be racist, but they also had less encounters with Asians and Asian American people as people on the East Coast or the West Coast. So that's why I feel very comfortable in either place. And one of the places I feel the most comfortable is in Hawaii, where it's extremely blended. I mean, our son is what they call hapa. And, you know, when we arrive in Hawaii, I just feel like something feels very, very comfortable about being there. So it has a lot to do with proximity.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things that I found stunning, actually, as we've tracked the incidence of anti-Asian hate crime in recent months and the last couple of years in the United States, coming largely out of the Trumpian excess and the demonization of, frankly, Chinese Americans and the Kung flu and all the rest of it. And not to say these problems didn't predate Trump, they did, but he got a big can of petrol and threw it on the top and then lit a match. And we've seen it actually in surprising cities. We've seen it in LA, we've seen it in San Francisco, we've seen it in New York, we've seen it on the subway, we've seen it in places like that, which is why we're doing this series. So last question for you, Billie, is what gives you hope? You're proud to be an Asian American. You're proud to be an American, I assume. What gives you hope for the future of Asian Americans in America?
I think, it's funny because this is going to be a little bit of a segued answer. So I'm going to wind myself around a bush for a little while before I come out.
It's permissible from Asian society rules. That's okay.
So I just found out recently that I'm going to be a grandmother. So I'm very, very... And and so it was the first time I really started thinking about what is it that I can transmit as a sort of nine-eye to my son and daughter-in-law's new baby boy. And what is it that he can sort of take with him? And I asked my son, do you feel Caucasian? Do you feel Asian? And he said, well, I suppose I really don't think about it. And I realized that answer didn't actually make me totally happy, because I do think I was hoping that he would in some way recognize that he is sort of both. And so I started thinking about what is the Chinese name I'm going to, as the grandparent, give my grandson. And I realized, I realized that it is this belief, and I can see it will sort of change with my son, that there is much to be passed on. And it may, take its different forms. So it's going to take its own form with me with a sort of Chinese name. But, it means that Asian Americans will not be the same sort of clearly maybe identifiable block, because I've married a Caucasian, he's married a Caucasian, but there will be a kind of very strong vine that will that is really built in to the generations to come. And so that actually made me feel very hopeful, because it's not necessarily the situation as it was, nor as it is, but it's going to be the recreation of a whole new idea about what being an Asian American is. And I think that there's great hope and power in that.
Well, welcome to Asian Caucasian grandparenthood. We have two little grandkids here, Chinese Australians, one who's 5, one who's 9. And the Qiming process was heaps of fun. The little girl's name is Josephine, and her Chinese name is Yuar. Yuar as in happy, R as in earth, and R. So Billie Tsien, thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate that you are quite literally building America, given the series is called Asian Americans Building America. And we thank you for the beautiful legacies you've created for us to live in and to work in and to enjoy and to experience, including our very own centre in Hong Kong. My name's Kevin Rudd. I'm from the Asian Society. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.